Welcome. You're joining me as I'm enjoying some of my homemade kombucha. It's not really the flavor that it says it is. I reuse a lot of bottles. So in this video, you are going to learn how to make kombucha and join me in my kitchen as I introduce you to my symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that enables the fermentation of the tea that's used to make kombucha. So kombucha is touted by many to be a functional drink. What that means is that a lot of scientists have studied it and have determined that it has health promoting sorts of potential. Now, scientists are still studying this so that they can better understand it. But one thing that we know is that kombucha is a probiotic drink. So probiotics, remember, are microorganisms that have health benefits, good bacteria, for example. And in kombucha, there are both yeast and bacteria. In fact, Scobi stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And one of the types of probiotic bacteria that we see in kombucha are the Lactobacilli. You've heard of those before. There are types of Lactobacilli in a lot of dairy fermentations, like yogurt. But additionally, there's a bacterium, one of the predominant genera, like the genus, the first name of the bacterium, so to speak, is Gluconoacidobacter. And this bacterium is super cool because what it can do is it can knit fabrics, cellulose fabrics. So in fact, here in this picture, it's called cellulose fleece. And you can see how it forms this network, and that's what gives rise to a very membranous sort of pellicle that we'll meet in the kombucha making. So remember that our body is home to trillions of residents. So in fact, we have more bacterial cells in and on us than we do human cells. How much they outnumber us is a little bit debated, but generally they're thought to outnumber us by a bit. And these bacteria are our residents of our healthy planet. So when our planet, our body planet, is healthy, it's generally interfaces with a healthy set of residents in and on our planet. So if our gut microbiota are healthy, then we tend to be healthy, not just physically, but they also impact our mental state and our ability to learn, even some of the recent literature. So the ability of our microbiome to support our health is, of course, directly affected by the types of things that we take in our diet. So if we eat good bacteria, drink probiotic beverages, eat probiotic foods, and foods that feed good bacteria, these are called prebiotics. Prebiotics are foods that feed the good bacteria. Then we will have healthy residents, and our planet as a whole will be healthy. So that's why it's going to be super fun to dive right in and learn with me about how to make kombucha. Hi everyone, welcome to my kitchen. This is part one of kombucha making. So kitchen microbiology, it's a fantastic way to spend your time in social isolation. So what I've done here to begin with is that I've gotten 2 gallons of water. So I make pretty large batches of kombucha. I have 3 that I keep going at any given time. So if I just put 2 gallons of water into a pot, I'm going to make a blueberry wild child and black currant beauty plus ginger kombucha. So you can make your kombucha from any kind of tea. Although I will say that the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, or the Scobi that we'll meet tomorrow, likes to eat caffeine. So in fact, kombucha is rarely a caffeinated beverage because the Scobi does chow down on the caffeine as an energy source. So we'll look tomorrow at the microbes that are found in the Scobi. But for today, you can just add your tea. And I go ahead and add the tea first. I bring it to a boil. And we'll come back here in a moment after this has reached a boil. But I generally do 1.8 ounces of tea. That's around 50 grams of tea. You can, again, choose your type of tea. You can pick varying flavors. You can add it in the form of loose leaf tea, which is my suggestion, but there are some flavors that you just simply can't get as loose leaf. So sometimes I end up with 12 bags of tea. That's about right for the amount that you would need in 2 gallons of water. And then what I'll do here is I'm going to bring this to a boil. And then meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and prepare the ginger. So what I've done here is I just have some fresh ginger root that I put into the blender. I'm going to add some water to the ginger root. The amount of water really just is about enough to cover whatever piece of ginger that you have in there. And then I just put it in the blender. I start with the chop cycle. And then I go to the mix and puree. And that just chops this up into tiny pieces. So now you just basically have a nice ginger puree. You've increased the surface area of the ginger so that it'll infuse into the water a little bit more rapidly, though you do want to bring the tea back to a boil once you've added this. So I wait until this tea comes to a boil, and then I go ahead and I add the ginger to that. That was no time at all for all of you, but for me it took a little while for the water to come to a boil. So everything is boiling now. The tea has steeped, and I'm ready to add in the ginger. So I'm just going to swish around this nice ginger puree and add that in. I'm going to let the water come back to a boil. That shouldn't take much time at all for it to reboil. And then once it does come back to a boil, I have measured out 2 cups of sugar. I like to buy sugar in bulk from our food co-op downtown, Big Hollow, if you haven't been there. And then it's more of a like raw sugar. It's not entirely the thick crystals, but it's a little less refined than some sugars. You could also use a mixture of brown sugar and white sugar. Sometimes I really like to do a small amount of molasses and a little bit of white sugar. Occasionally I also add some maple syrup. And if you want to make, rather than kombucha, if you want to make June, you can use honey. So those are all options. I'm going to go ahead and add the 2 cups of sugar because the ginger has now been at a raging boil for a while. And I'm going to wait and bring that to a boil just to make sure that everything is sterile in there and that the only bacteria and yeast growing in the kombucha are the Scobi. So look forward to tomorrow getting to meet that Scobi. But for now, all I do is I just give this a good stir, make sure that all of the sugar is mixed in, and then I put a cover on this. I let it boil for maybe 30 seconds with the cover on, and then I just move it off of the heat. Welcome back. We have our boiled tea. It's ready to go. I left it overnight so that it would cool. So now what we're going to do is tap the previous batch. So this batch was a hibiscus, rosehip, and ginger. And what I'm doing right now is I'm just adding strawberries to the secondary. So essentially I'm just cutting strawberries and putting them in the bottles so that the secondary fermentation can take place now that the primary fermentation is done. So once you get your strawberries or peaches or whatever it is that you want to use in your secondary into the bottles, then you just simply go ahead and tap this bottle. This takes just a little bit of time. I generally do sort of a beer style entry into the bottle so that it doesn't get too bubbly. It depends upon your particular Scobi and the particular tea you use, how bubbly your product is. I once had one of my athletes, who was also one of my advisees, he wanted to know if I bubbled CO2 through my kombucha afterwards because he couldn't figure out how I got so much bubble. Apparently some people do that. I don't do that at all. I just do a nice secondary fermentation and I get natural carbonation. So the bubbles are all natural in mine. So you may be wondering, how do you get a hold of a Scobi? You can order them online, but to be quite honest, you can also grow them yourself. So if you get a bottle of your favorite kombucha and you enjoy about, 2/3 of the bottle, just pour it out and then drink that in a separate container, so you don't want to contaminate the initial container, but then just put a cloth like this and a rubber band over the top of that initial bottle and set it in a dark closet for about a week. You'll find that you'll get a small Scobi on there. You can then take that Scobi and put it into a small batch of very highly sugared tea and let it go in the closet for another week, and you'll have a nice sized Scobi of your own without ever having to purchase one. Now, if you happen to be in Laramie, I have lots of babies, so an even easier way to get a Scobi is to come and get a baby from me. I can always set it out by my mailbox for you to come by and pick it up. So we're getting close here. I've tapped 2 bottles. I'm on the 3rd. Lately, I've started to take to having a couple of smaller ones for a grab and go lunch. So if you're needing to have a Zoom meeting and you want to have a little kombucha for your Zoom meeting, you can just grab it and have a small batch rather than having to pour it out of the larger ones. I get these bottles obviously initially from the store and then I reuse like those 4 R's. But also once I give somebody kombucha, they tend to give me more bottles. So I often end up with more bottles than I know what to do with. So I think we're just about tapped. And you'll remember that I start this with about 2 gallons worth. So I get a pretty nice amount as my product. I have 3 of these going at any given time. And that's just barely enough to supply my best friends and my family. So I feel like you'd have to have 4 or 5 or 6 if you wanted to start selling it or getting it to additional people beyond your small friend circle. So the sort of hard job starts at this point because we need to clean out the fermentation doer, if you will. And make sure that the Scobi is clean, and I generally take the baby off of the mother and I either save the baby or I get rid of it depending upon the situation. So these are now ready to go into the closet. So not the bad kind of being closeted, but the good kind of being closeted, where they can go through their secondary fermentation. So I have a nice dark closet over here. For a few days to a full week, depending upon how eager you are to drink your product. And the goal there is that they're going through this secondary fermentation. You start to get a little more bubble, the fruit flavor infuses into the product. So now we're ready to meet the Scobi, the moment you've all been waiting for. So I always do a thorough job of washing my hands, and then from there, I handle my Scobis with bare hands. I used to use gloves, and then I started to realize that as long as my hands were clean, that I think the Scobi enjoys a little bit of massaging. Make sure your hands are clean though. You all know good hand washing protocol by now with COVID. So we're ready to grab out the Scobi. Now one thing I often will do, and I should do this, is take just another small cup if there is a little bit left in here. Of course you can drink it, but I like to take one small cup, maybe this is like 16 ounces, something like that. And I use this as an inoculum for the next batch. So we're just gonna set aside this inoculum for our next batch. All right, it's time. We're ready to dive in and get the Scobi. This particular Scobi is named Pele because I started it from a culture of kombucha in Hawaii. And so I'm gonna pull it out. This almost looks like human flesh, but what this is a cellulosic biofilm. It's a pellicle like we see in lab when we grow certain types of bacteria, a surface membrane. So as I said, a cellulosic biofilm, cellulose is a polymer of glucose held together by beta linkages. Cellulose is a very strong material, and in fact, one of my undergraduate researchers did research on using this cellulose to make fabric, to make textiles, and he was able to make things like watch bands and even jewelry out of this because the cellulose can be dried and treated and dyed. So it's a pretty cool thing. Now, what is in here as far as microbes go? Well, this is a combination, right? A symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. So it's bacteria and yeast. The bacteria are things like Kombucha, or also known as Gluconoacidobacter. Gluconoacidobacter xylanus. Xylanus is, you recognize as a polymer name. So you'll notice here, this is a beautiful Scobi, really healthy. But what you're seeing is that the mother has had a baby. So this is the baby. So if I were to put this in a jar for you and put a little bit of extra of the juices in there, you could use this to start your whole new kombucha culture. But I already have a lot of babies, so I'm gonna let this baby go for now. And then I'm just gonna focus on, the dirty job of cleaning. So I just clean this out. I actually clean it every single time. I find that's a really good way to keep your kombucha batches being really healthy. So the first thing I do is I clean it with hot water and soap, and I just scrub it. And I just scrub it thoroughly. I get around the edges, and you'll notice sometimes that there may be places where the strands are just little remnants of the Scobi, where the Scobi has grown in a fibrous way. So I mentioned that it's a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, and I mentioned some of the bacteria in there, but I didn't mention the yeast. So there are things like Zygosaccharomyces. Every single Scobi is different. So we could send this off to get sequenced. We could look at the total microbial populations and find out what's in my Scobi is likely different than what's in other people's Scobi. And it differs too on the time frame after start of fermentation. So a lot of these, right, are acetic acid fermenters. So they're producing acetic acid. We talked a lot about producing lactic acid in our metabolism section, but acetic acid, remember, is another product of metabolism, of anaerobic metabolism. And acetic acid is vinegar. So there is, if you leave a kombucha culture for far too long, it can taste vinegary. But if you don't leave it too long, then it doesn't really taste vinegary at all. It just tastes like nicely fermented. Of course, you get some gaseous products from that as well, and that's where the carbonation comes from. The carbon dioxide, remember, thoroughly worn up, totally used up, fully oxidized carbon in the form of CO2. So I generally also, it depends, like every other time I also scrub this out, I take it fully apart and scrub it. And I have a tiny, tiny test tube brush that I use to do that. I scrubbed this one the last time, so I'm gonna let it be. So then the very last thing that I do with the cleaning is I take white vinegar and I pour in just enough white vinegar to just a thin line on the bottom. And then I use a cool water, not cold, but just sort of cool. And I run a little bit of that in to dilute the vinegar. And then I swish the vinegar around. I let the vinegar through the spout. I swish it around in here. And then because it's not too hot, I just swish it all the way, covering all the sides there and onto the Scobi. So now I can wash the Scobi. And I generally give the Scobi a massage. You'll notice that there's sometimes bits of tea on it. The tea will cause the Scobi to get colored. One baby I gave to somebody was pink because the tea that I had made right before that was a raspberry tea. So you really, when you do this and you massage your Scobi, you really start to feel the nature of the cellulose and how strong that is as a fibrous material. It's a phenomenal material in terms of the way that it can pack, the glucose molecules can pack closely next to one another. But of course we know glucose is hydrophilic, so Scobi takes on a lot of water. That's one of the limitations with using a Scobi or cellulosic biofilm to make textiles, is that you get your watch band wet and suddenly it expands, it gets large, because of course the hydroxyls on the glucose molecules, like, they love water, right? They love interacting with water. Okay, so my Scobi is clean and it's ready to go, and I put it back in. And then make sure your spout is closed. Add your starter, just a starter inoculum. Like we do in lab, we inoculate with an initial amount. So that gives it a little head start, because then there's some of these microorganisms in the culture, in the broth part of the culture already. And now you're ready to add your tea. So use a strainer, because remember we've got loose leaf tea in there. There's also a lot of that fibrous ginger root left. So then this is a nice way to just catch that. So remember we basically did a gingerberry. We basically made gingerberry, though we added some black currant in there. So we could call it black currant gingerberry. Yeah, looks good. So this. And then of course you've got nice smelling tea to go in the trash. Your trash smells good after this. And then now you're ready to put the top back on. I change out the cloth napkin at least every other time I do this, just to ensure that it stays really nice and clean. I always think to myself, if this is sort of it's like its own organ, and you don't want to get anything gross in it, because it won't metabolize properly if we add something that's not supposed to be there. Just like your stomach, if you put something down there that's not supposed to be there, it's not a sterile environment, but you want it to be a sacred environment, right? Your Scobi is what it eats too. Okay, so now we're gonna label this. Always label your products and your brews, because you forget, and put it back onto its little rack. And then I have a little room, a teeny tiny room dedicated to kombucha fermenting. So that's a wrap.